begin this evening's event, so this afternoon rather, I'd like to invite Dr. Peter Simpson, Dean of the College of Graduate Studies and Associate Provost, Academic Affairs and Strategy, on stage to say a few words.
Thank you, Victoria. It's my pleasure to acknowledge that we're gathered in the unceded territory of the Silks Okanagan peoples, and we have guests joining us in person and online from a number of other different territories across Canada. And as guests on this beautiful land, we're privileged to live here and to teach, learn, and pursue research here. I'd like to express my appreciation for the sense of community among our group of universities, expressed through a range of collaborations, including the Western Deans Agreement and this event, which is sponsored by the Western Deans of Graduate Studies. This is our second time hosting the Western Regionals. The last time we hosted was in 2016. The 3-minute thesis competition is, for me, a real highlight of the academic year. I've been involved in it for over a decade, and I feel that the quality of the talks just gets better every year. The research is diverse and exciting, and I'd like to thank all of our graduate students, those who are here and those who are not, for their contributions to our collective research enterprise. I'm looking forward to a great afternoon of talks, and thank you for being here.
Now, before we begin, before we begin, I want to give you guys a bit of a background on let's move on. A bit of a background on how 3MT was born. The idea of 3MT came about at a time when the state of Queensland was suffering from severe drought. To conserve water, residents were encouraged to time their showers. Many people had a 3-minute egg timer fixed to the wall in their bathroom. The dean of the graduate school at the time, Emeritus Professor Alan Lawson, put 2 and 2 together, and the idea of the 3MT competition was born, challenging grad students to describe their research in under 3 minutes to a general audience. The 3-minute thesis competition was first held at the University of Queensland in 2008. Enthusiasm for the concept has led to increases in university participation year over year. The competition is now held at over 900 universities across more than 85 countries. This afternoon, we will hear presentations from 17 master's and doctoral students. Each competitor has only 3 minutes, or 180 seconds, and 1 slide to tell you and our judges about their research. This is no easy feat. To put it into context, the average person speaks somewhere between 125 and 150 words per minute. The average length of a PhD dissertation is somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 words. This means that students would need somewhere over 530 minutes to share their entire dissertation. Today we asked them to do it in just 3 minutes. Now if you have a look, we have a whole list of the competition rules in your event program. The challenge that these students are facing today has its rewards. First place will receive $1,500. Second place will receive $750, and third place will receive $500. The People's Choice Award winner, as voted by you, will take home $250. Voting will take place online later in the event. Our first and second place winners will also move forward to the National 3MT Showcase at this year's Canadian Association for Graduate Studies Conference in Toronto. Before we begin, we'll introduce our distinguished panel of judges. We have Dr. Leslie Cormack, Principal and Deputy Vice Chancellor of UBC Okanagan, Heather Berenger, Associate Provost, Academic Operations and Services at UBC Okanagan, and Martin Youssef, Associate Vice President of University Relations at UBC Okanagan. Our judges have the difficult task of scoring the presentations today, which are being judged on comprehension and content and engagement and communication. More details about the judging criteria are listed in your event program. In between each presentation, I will be asking the competitors questions about their research. This will allow judges to score and help you learn more about the research. There will be a break throughout the event, and immediately following the event, you're invited to join us for a catered reception here in this room. Now the moment we are all here for, the first presenter. I'm sure you can all hear me much better now. All right, well, let's introduce our first presenter. Up first, we have Madison Oud. Madison is in the Master of Science in Natural Resources and Environmental Studies program at the University of Northern British Columbia. Their presentation is titled Avian Family Planning, Mouth Color in Chickadee Nestlings, Depending on Urban Living and Nest Timing.
Hello. Today, I want to speak to everyone as an authority in avian family planning, despite lacking any experience as either a parent or a bird. So, whether you are a human or a chickadee, habitat plays a vital role in child care. We humans, we may look for playgrounds or school districts, but these chickadees, they're trying to find the finest grub that a nestling could ask for. While chickadees are often fit for these urban or rural environments, urban locations present these unique challenges, or even some potential benefits. Urban areas have tons of cement, roads, buildings, cars, humans, and plenty of novel vegetation. This means urban sites are much hotter, brighter, and noisier than their rural counterparts. Now, how can we actually measure the quality of food within this area? Well, young chickadees have these bright yellow clown lips, a trait that's actually lost in adulthood. These yellow lips are more important while living in the nest, providing a large, enticing, round yellow basketball hoop that communicates to mom and dad, hey, slam dunk food in here. So, these yellow lips are actually diet dependent, requiring prey that contain carotenoids, a building block for color. With these carotenoids, they're associated with high nutrients, high protein, and high water content. So, this actually creates a bright, vibrant indicator of health. So, after observing these sad, drab, white nestling lips in a caterpillar poor season, I was inspired to make a portable photo studio, and I ended up documenting 120 nestlings among 23 different nests. To anyone observing the center photo there, yes, I know my hands are a mess. Yes, I probably need some kind of manicure, and yes, I will take charitable donations. Moving on. As expected, aging nestlings seemingly accumulated these carotenoids, and they gained yellow coloration as well as color intensity with age. Rural nestlings retained more yellow color, suggesting higher differences between these diets, such as higher quality, higher carotenoid prey, or greater access to said prey. Most insightful of all, we found that mouth color and its intensity is actually stronger when nest timing coincides with caterpillar emergence, specifically those caterpillars feeding on the budding leaves of local coniferous trees, a trend that that appears stronger in these rural environments. So, this actually demonstrates the importance of both nest location and timing. And there's so much more to learn. And now I'm exploring mouth color and how it's impacted by immune responses and influences of parasitic blowflies. What should we take away from this? While people may argue that food is the foundation of a good home, these chickadees would probably tell you nest timing and location is the foundation for good food. Thank you.
Thank you. So during this time, we'll let our judges take a minute to score, and I will ask you a few questions. So do most bird species have nestlings with yellow mouths?
Specifically, species that are found within nesting cavities. While in a dark cavity nest, these mouths are actually really good for seeing them in the dark. So these cavity nesters tend to have either UV reflectance or yellow coloration, but these species that are in open nests or nests that aren't covered tend to have a red color that is better suited for that area.
And is color the only way that nestlings seem to communicate with their parents?
No, they are very noisy, very loud, and are just begging for food. If you open the nest box, they will just start screaming at you. So there's a lot involved.
And could this data be used for urban planning or conservation purposes?
Likely, but luckily chickadees are in a fairly stable state right now, but we don't know what the future is going to be like. But a lot of this is actually really applicable if we do have species that are in these urban environments that are struggling, or if we specifically have these cavity nesters where we do have birds declining in this area.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Madison.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Our next presenter is Jenna Latain. Jenna is in the Master of Science in Biochemistry program at the University of Lethbridge. Jenna's presentation is titled "The Buzz About Honeybee Viruses."
Have you ever gone to the supermarket and purchased a variety of fruits and berries, like apples, oranges, or blueberries, and never really thought twice about it? Or bought a bottle of honey so that you could have some sweetness in your cup of tea? All of this would not be possible without the hard work of honeybees. Farmers rely heavily on honeybees for the pollination of many crops, and over the past couple of decades, honeybees have been facing a significant population loss. Over the winter of 2021 to 2022, 46% of honeybee colonies died in Canada, a very large increase when compared to previous years. There are many reasons that contribute to this, but one that has seen more urgency is viruses. Viruses are the tiny troublemakers that make us sick, but they can also infect honeybees with big negative consequences. There are currently no treatments available to fight honeybee viruses, so we must do the research into learning more about them. But what are viruses and how do they operate? Think of viruses as small burglars trying to break into a large office complex. They sneak in and they start stealing the precious office equipment. They see the fancy copier room and they spot the new high-tech printer and copier in the corner, and they decide to use this to create a bunch of copies of themselves, so that they can go wreak havoc in the office, take over the entire building, and eventually hop over to the neighbors and do the exact same thing there. In a similar way, viruses can invade a honeybee's cells, or the buildings, and hijack their cellular machinery, like the photocopiers. And you're probably wondering, why does this matter? Knowing what machinery is getting hijacked is important because it can help in the development of drugs to fight those little viral burglars. My thesis work aims to find out which specific machinery are getting hijacked by honeybee viruses and how this relates to the host's immunity. We can take a part of the viral burglar that we make ourselves in the lab and mix it together with all the honeybee's cellular machinery, like the photocopiers, and see what ends up sticking. Furthermore, we can investigate how tightly binding the virus is to these machinery by using multiple biophysical techniques. And once we have a better idea about how the virus operates using those machinery, we can look at developing antivirals to stop those burglars from even stealing and using the photocopiers in the first place. If we want a future with delicious fruits, bountiful crops, and sweet honey, we need to put the effort into helping the bees. Thank you.
Excellent job. Thank you, Jenna. Now, what are some of the viruses that infect the honeybees?
Yeah, so there are over 20 known common viruses that infect honeybees, and they're found all over the world. And they range from infecting adult bees to infecting the larvae, like the bee's young, and even the queen bees. So some common viruses are deformed wing virus, Israeli acute paralysis virus, sackbrood virus, black queen cell virus, and obviously a lot more.
And what are some of the symptoms of the viruses?
Yeah, so obviously the symptoms vary from virus to virus, but kind of a good indication of what the symptom could be is the name of the virus. So for example, deformed wing virus causes deformed wings. And sac-bird virus affects the brood, and it basically causes them to become sac-like, and they fill with fluid, so they don't look like a normal larvae, and they basically dry up and die. But some other common symptoms include like shininess, greasy or hairless, decreased body size, and also another indicator of viral infection is a lot of dead bees found outside of your colonies or the entrance of your hives.
And how do honeybee viruses spread?
Yeah, so there's two main ways that honeybee viruses spread, either through horizontal or vertical transmission. And horizontal transmission is basically any bee-to-bee contact, kind of like humans. So a bee can spread virus from one bee to another, and this also includes spreading viruses through shared flowers, so they can actually shed their viruses onto the flower. Healthy bee can come along, pick up that virus, and get sick. There's also a parasitic mite called Varroa destructor, and they can spread, they basically house those viruses and they can spread them around that way. Whereas vertical transmission is basically viruses spreading from the queen to her offspring, so they can actually go transgenerationally that way.
Great job. Thank you, Jenna.
Thank you, everyone.
Next up, we have Mahir Shroff. Mahir is in the Doctor of Philosophy in Physics at the University of Victoria. His presentation is titled Peeking into Nature's Pool Game.
Let's imagine playing pool, but this time, let's imagine playing against a professional player. It's their turn to strike the cue ball, and as professionals do, they seem to have accounted for all the physics that's required to drive the ball into the pocket. They've accounted for the angle of incidence, the spin to apply on the ball, and the force that's needed to strike the cue ball with. All of these intuitive and maybe not so intuitive calculations are based on the laws of physics as we know them. But what if our understanding of physics was incomplete? What if there was an extra force acting on the ball, causing it to deviate from its path, possibly missing the pocket? Very frustrating for a pool player, but at the same time, very exciting for a physicist. In the macroscopic world, classical physics works to a marvelous precision that we use in our everyday lives. Based on classical physics alone, we send people to the moon. But in the nanoscopic world, at the level of which individual particles are studied, we find gaps in our understanding. We know that the model is incomplete. The standard model of particle physics, our current rule book, very accurately describes the existence of several particles which have since been discovered, but still fails to answer some key questions. My PhD research aims to explore these gaps, to probe areas where we can potentially see the standard model failing, and therefore search for physics beyond the standard model. And now, back to the pool table, but this time, the nanoscopic one. At the Large Hadron Collider located at CERN between Switzerland and France, several pool-like balls called protons are accelerated in a circular ring and collided against each other. Just like the professional pool player, we can calculate the angle of scattering given the laws of the standard model. But what we're doing now is we're colliding the balls several times to see whether or not they enter the pocket every single time. Using camera-like detectors, we can track the output of the collisions and we can study their scattering angles. And if there is a deviation from what we expect or what the standard model tells us we should expect, we can use model extensions to explain this difference. So, what's the use of all this, you may ask? Well, the benefit to anyone who enjoys a game of pool is rather obvious. But as humanity advances to technologies based on the nanoscopic world, our understanding of the laws that govern such a world are paramount. This knowledge acts as a catalyst for medical technologies as well as computing innovations, as has been the case in the past. It is a catalyst to ensure that the systems we develop based on these new technologies are as reliable as a well-aimed shot destined for the pool pocket. Thank you.
Excellent job. Great job.
Thanks.
Now, CERN is in Switzerland, has the largest particle physics laboratory in the world. Have you visited, and what did you find most exciting if you did?
Yes, so indeed, I have visited, and there were a bunch of very cool things. So there's the ring, the accelerator ring, there are detectors. But the coolest thing I thought were the people. So it's a very large organization. People come in from all over the place, and everyone has the spirit of collaboration. They put aside their differences, and everyone's just so interested in finding the answers to science, and everyone's really cool. You wouldn't think that, but everyone's really cool there. Yeah, so the people and just the collaborative spirit, I thought was the most fascinating part of the whole institute.
Interesting. And if the particles in your study could speak, what do you think they would say, and what would they reveal about the secrets of the universe?
Right, good question. So I guess the particles in the collider would probably say, get out of my way, because they're colliding with each other. So it's more of like a roller coaster. The particles are kind of like humans, or not even humans, but just the animal kingdom. Particles are different. They have their own unique personalities. So there's some that are life of the parties. They interact with everyone. Something like the electrons. They interact a lot with a lot of other forces. There's some that just interact with some forces. So maybe some friend groups, but not all the others. Yeah, so each of them have their own unique personalities. Yeah, just like humans, I guess, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Our next presenter is Tana Jones. Tana is in the Master of Business Administration program at Thompson Rivers University. Her presentation is titled Unlocking Status Quo Bias, Conquering the Wicked Problem of Kamloops Housing.
What's one of the most common problems facing many Canadians today? Housing. Canada is facing a national housing crisis. It's a complex issue. It's a complex issue with facets at many levels, including federal government and individual citizens. But the problem isn't just with housing supply. It's that the type of housing that Canadians have access to often doesn't meet their needs best. In Canada, we're generally limited to single-family housing primarily, or some apartment-style living. There's very little in between that meets the needs of demographics such as retirees or single folks who maybe don't need as much space or don't have as much to spend. Polaric's missing middle housing concept encompasses that middle ground, and it fits the gap between what people have and what they need. It's been touted by local government leaders and leaders in the field as an emergent solution to the housing crisis, but it hasn't significantly been tested from an academic perspective. Using a qualitative research in a place-specific context, this research starts with examining the current housing in Kamloops, BC, determining that yes, in fact, the middle is missing. Next, interviews with 16 participants across 3 industries provide insight on the barriers to and solutions for rectifying the housing problem in Kamloops. The study results show that housing culture in Kamloops is notably paradoxical, with conflicting values and priorities on many levels. It's a classic wicked problem, so something that's unsolvable and many layers to it that will require work as far as leadership and clear leadership, industry collaboration, according to goal-setting theory, to be able for different groups to come together to solve this housing crisis. The results of this research expand goal-setting theory, but they also contribute to providing practical insights for policymakers, giving better information for better decision-making. Perhaps the most important part of this is that it challenges what we think we already know about the largest single purchase that most of us will make in our lifetime, our home. If housing was different, or if there was more diversity, what would that change for you? One participant put it best: it's about getting people excited about what housing could be. That's what will make the difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Tana. That was excellent. Why choose a housing study for an MBA?
That might be a little bit of a longer story. I've always been interested in housing thanks to my grandpa and my mom. They were very influential in my early years to look at architecture. But then I had the opportunity with TRU and my tax to be involved in a researcher in residence program at the City of Kamloops. And the professor, Dr. Glado, amazing, took the time to identify that I had that interest. And because of that interest, she directed me into this study for housing, which makes no sense for an MBA. So thank you, Dr. Glado.
And from your study results, what were the main obstacles hindering the implementation of missing middle housing in Kamloops?
Well, my research isn't finalized yet, but one of the ones I can share today is that there's, in Kamloops, there's a prevalent car-centric culture. And I'm not just talking about urban sprawl, I'm talking about the attachment to the car, the attachment to having the garage in front of your house so that you can park the car in the driveway. Those things that hinder community, or those things that hinder that sense of being able to take up less space, having an alleyway behind your house. These are things that often we don't think about that matter, but they really do as far as creating community. So that was one of the main barriers.
And finally, any recommendations for overcoming these conflicting values and priorities identified in your study?
Again, still in progress. But one of the key things that arrived was that there seems to be a lot of layers of policy. So being able to streamline those layers of policy, being able to streamline development permit processes, those are some of the very practical ways. But creating less hoops and clearer communication for everybody to get on the same page would be super helpful.
Excellent job. Thank you, Tana.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Pawanjit Sandhu. Pawanjit is in the Doctor of Philosophy in Biochemistry and Molecular Biology program at UBC Okanagan, and her presentation is titled, How Many Amino Acids Are There?
Let me throw a word at you. Protein. What do we think of when we think of protein? Protein bar, protein powder, or maybe you are wondering, did I have enough protein today? Proteins are these molecules that make up big muscles in our body and are itself made up of tiny Lego-like blocks called amino acids, as shown on my slide. We have 20 protein amino acids. That means all of our proteins are made from the same 20 amino acids. However, there are way more than 20 amino acids in nature. So when we eat fish or tofu or any other food, we are eating way more than 20 amino acids. These amino acids that do not make proteins have other positive or negative impacts on our bodies. These amino acids are used to treat diseases like schizophrenia and Parkinson's. They make hormones in our bodies like happy hormones such as serotonin. One of the negative impacts is that these amino acids can act as toxins. For example, an amino acid called domoic acid can contaminate seafood. So when we eat that contaminated seafood, it can cause brain seizures and even death. We don't know how many of these amino acids there are. We don't know what their function is for most of them. That is because we do not have techniques to study these amino acids. That's where my research comes in. My thesis lays the groundwork and asks the question, how many amino acids there are. To do so, I'm developing techniques to extract amino acids, to separate them from mixtures and from each other, to identify them and to measure their quantities. In the first step, I used an online database called PubChem, which has a collection of all the chemicals known to humans, and from there I extracted all the amino acids. From there, I created a database called Amino Acid Database, which has over 8,000 amino acid entries. So this database will be publicly available for everyone to use. Currently, I'm validating this database to identify the sources of amino acids. I will be using this database along with the techniques that I'm developing to look for amino acids in plants, which has potential to protect our crops against climate change. These techniques can be used to study amino acids in all different types of samples, including humans. Eventually, these techniques can be used to develop diagnostic and screening tests to determine the nutritional and health status of people and plants. Thank you.
Great job, thank you. Now, what would you say is the impact of your research?
I think it's this research has a very wide impact on all different industries. So as I mentioned briefly in my talk, so these methods can be used to discover amino acids that we don't even know of, and they have probably play a very important role in very important diseases in us, and also can be used to protect plants and develop new strategies for that as well.
How abundant are these amino acids?
So they are everywhere. I didn't know that, but so they are in water, they are in environment. A lot of them are produced by microbes, so they also travel up the chain and are then found in plants and then in animals, and then they go to us. So they are basically everywhere, in the water, in the air, in the land, everywhere.
And what methods did you use to develop your techniques?
So I'm using a lot of analytical chemistry methods. So I'm using liquid chromatography to separate my compounds, and then also some mass spectrometry-based detection methodologies to detect those in the samples.
Excellent job. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Our next presenter is Jeremy Laity. Jeremy is in the Master of Arts in Interdisciplinary Humanities program at Trinity Western University, and his presentation is titled Relationship and Agency, the Pioneer Settler in Coast Salish, British Columbia.
In British Columbia, we often hear that we live on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Indigenous people. What we don't hear as much about is how exactly the province transitioned from a fully Indigenous territory to a British colony. One historian who thought a lot about this problem was Robin Fisher, who argued that in the early 1800s, these relationships were dominated by the fur trade and characterized by mutually beneficial trading relationships. According to Fisher, though, this all changes in 1858 with the gold rush and the influx of settlement that follows. Fisher sees this as marking the exclusion of Indigenous people economically and socially, and eliminating any opportunities for mutual collaboration. In my research, I decided to challenge Fisher's thesis to determine whether or not 1858 and the influx of white settlement really did mark a turning point in Indigenous settler relationships. Focusing on the traditional Coast Salish territory of the Fraser Valley and the lands surrounding the Salish Sea, I examined written sources, including pioneer memoirs, newspaper articles, and Indian agency records. Records that record the day-to-day individual interactions between these two groups of people. Through this research, I found that Fisher was right as far as the province's urban centers were concerned. However, in the smaller agricultural, rural communities of the province's periphery, quite the opposite was actually true. In these areas, settlers acquired land, and they were faced with the task of producing homesteads in really difficult circumstances. In order to survive, they had to actually integrate themselves into existing Indigenous social and economic systems and adapt to Indigenous technologies. Many of these settlers adopted the canoe as their primary form of transportation. They hired Indigenous workers on their farms. They traded with their Indigenous neighbors, and many of them even intermarried with the local Indigenous people, enveloping themselves into the pre-existing kinship networks that define Coast Salish space. Realizing this is important as we grapple with our province's history, but it may be even more valuable as we work together towards a future that sees relationships with Indigenous people as valuable, just as they were in our colonial past. And so that's why I focused on realizing that Indigenous people and settlers coexisted in mutually beneficial relationships well into the late 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Can you talk about any challenges you faced in your research?
Yeah, so one of the main challenges was actually identifying source material. Early pioneer settlers did not produce a large amount of literary output, and so it's a little bit difficult to track down reliable items that actually describe these kind of relationships, and then to kind of parse out the implicit biases that are present in these. So it was really challenging both collating and interpreting the source material that was existing.
And why is this research so important?
Yeah, I think I kind of covered in my presentation, the idea that settlement itself, marginalized Indigenous people, is predicated on this kind of notion that settlement and indigeneity cannot peacefully coexist. There's this kind of opposition of priorities there. And so when we realize that actually they did coexist, and there was a possibility for symbiotic relationship, and that it's a little bit more complicated. I think that also opens avenues towards reconciliation and resurgence as we realize, how we can kind of reframe these same relationships in our future.
And building off of this project, is there anything you want to look into next?
Yeah, I've really become interested in the issue of intermarriage and how Coast Salish nations were able to extend their sovereignty within settler culture through intermarriage, largely still carrying on traditional Indigenous marriage practices. So I'm really looking forward to looking further into that in the future.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Michael Mensah. Michael is in the Doctor of Philosophy in Biology program at the University of Regina, and his presentation is titled Fresh Solutions for Salty Cows.
What do we do as humans when we are thirsty or feel dehydrated? We find something refreshing to drink. Now, what do cows like these do when they feel the same? They also try to find something refreshing to drink. Now imagine being thirsty and feeling so dehydrated from a hike in the sun, only to be served a glass of ocean water, making you even thirstier and more dehydrated. This is the unfortunate situation that many cows in the prairies face every dry summer. In 2017, over 200 cows died in Canada because the ponds they drank from had salt content that was at the time higher than the ocean. Aside from the $300,000 estimated financial loss, farmers reported they had to deal with what felt like losing their family. The soils in the prairies are rich in salts, and many similar cases of high salts in ponds may arise in the future. This is why my research explores several environmental factors to identify the key features that cause elevated salt levels in ponds. To do this, I go out to the field to complete surveys which involve observing and recording features such as vegetation cover and land use practices around 40 selected ponds. I also collected water and soil samples to assess their unique properties in the lab with some fancy techniques. The goal is to gather and assess information from field surveys and lab analysis to know what causes ponds to either stay fresh or become salty. Initial results show that vegetation around ponds slow down the transport of salts from surrounding soils into pond water. This finding highlights the opportunity that plants offer in keeping ponds fresh for much more extended periods. For ponds that are already salty, my study is testing the effectiveness of two mitigation options in reducing their salt content. The first uses floating islands. These are platforms with plants that take up salt and store them in their roots, stems, and leaves. In the second, I am testing how well dredging, which digs up salty sediment from the bottom of ponds, keeps water fresh and safe for consumption. Further investigations are underway to better understand how identified key features work together to reduce salts in ponds. Such an understanding is valuable for keeping pond water fresh and sad cows happy to continue serving us with the freshest beef and the most refreshing milk drinks. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. What sparked your interest in water quality research?
Okay, that's a good one. So, growing up near the beach might have created some natural attraction towards water and its related studies. I will, however, trace my interest to my undergrad studies in Ghana, where I had the opportunity to be involved in some water quality assessment projects where I tested water quality for samples from fish ponds, and this really sparked my interest to delve into freshwater management, and this led me to the UK, where I studied freshwater management. As part of what I did there, I assessed the benefits that a citizen science project had delivered to a canal. And from there, as a natural progression, I took up my current research position with Dr. Kerry Finley, a top limnologist here in Canada. And I've been working with her to identify natural processes that helps to improve water quality for cows in the prairies.
And you seem to be really well-rounded with this topic, but did you find any challenges within your research?
Challenges, for sure. Even finding your way around here, one of the main challenges getting around, yes, I had to get used to using Google Maps to locate my study sites and all of that, and generally having to, delve into literature that kind of were relevant to the topic that I'm researching. While it wasn't very challenging, I had to, dig deep to some very old archives. So aside from that, there's been so much support such that, the challenges now seem like, all part of the fun story. So it's really going good.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Our next presenter is Alexandra Gagnon. Alexandra is in the Master of Arts in Sociology program at the University of Alberta. Her presentation is titled Remand, Release, Reconvict.
Growing up, I was often told about how awesome recycling is. Many of us have heard the phrase reduce, reuse, recycle, and have seen the 3 arrow symbol behind me. It's a genius system, as once something enters, it's forever in a cycle of reproduction. It's an environmentally friendly process. While keeping plastics out of ecosystems is a great idea, doing the same with people who are incarcerated is not. I study what's known as the cycle of reoffending, and I find that it's similar to the idea of recycling. When a person goes to prison, they don't come out reformed and ready to contribute to society. Instead, we're seeing that they become trapped in a cycle of release and imprisonment. They can't get out of it. When prisoners have reduced access to social programming and we reuse tactics that are not working, we end up with the recycling of human beings in our criminal justice system. And unlike recycling plastics, this is not sustainable, and it must be addressed. I'm part of a team working to tackle this problem through the University of Alberta Prison Project. We are conducting interviews and surveys in Western Canadian provincial institutions with 800 incarcerated people, and will follow up with them 6 times post-release from prison. This is the first systematic study on barriers to re-entry in Canada, and will tell us what challenges formerly incarcerated people face and why around half of them end up back in prison. For example, consider John, who I interviewed on his day of release at age 28. Having first been incarcerated at 19, the longest stretch of freedom John had known was a mere 3 months. Shockingly, he told me about his intentions to return to prison. Why? Because he needed urgent dental care for a tooth abscess, a service only accessible to him in prison due to the high costs on the outside. And despite having a dental appointment scheduled for the very next day, this critical aspect was overlooked in the decision to release him. Trapped in the cycle of reoffending, Stats Canada tells us that each year of John's incarceration cost Canadian taxpayers an average of $119,000. However, if we choose to invest in social and correctional community services aimed at addressing John's needs, we can reduce this cost to $31,000 a year. With almost 3,000 people incarcerated in Alberta alone, the stakes are not just human, it's also economic. Through our research, we will identify effective social services, pinpoint areas for improvement, and create the first evidence-based policy recommendations to end the recycling of human beings in our justice system. Thank you.
Excellent job. Why do you feel researching incarceration is important in Canada?
Absolutely. So Canada has a unique history of colonialization. And additionally, what we're seeing happening in Canada right now is a person doesn't go to prison and successfully go back into their community. Instead, along the way, something happens. Many people don't have the support that they need to go back into their communities, or they don't have a plan set up for them. So it's important within Canada to research this so that we can create ways to better promote rehabilitation within our justice system and help people who are trying to successfully go back into their communities.
And you mentioned the example of the individual who had some issues with dental care. Are there any other barriers you've seen while conducting your research?
Mm-hmm. So dental care is one example that I've shared today. There's also many other things. For example, transportation. Do you have a car that can get you from point A to B? What about, do you have access to health services? Or what about ID? Do you have a license that can prove who you are? Many people don't, or access to housing. So those are some of the other barriers.
And how does your research impact local, provincial, and global communities?
So the findings from this research will be used to impact multiple levels of governance. The findings we'd like to have to create evidence-based policy recommendations, which will impact local communities as well as provincial and federal levels. And at the global level, it contributes to a wider conversation about the over-incarceration of marginalized folks in Western nations and how we can promote rehabilitation in justice systems.
Excellent job. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Marin Habbick. Marin is in the Master of Science in Virology program at the University of Saskatchewan, and her presentation is titled, "Is the Man Cold for Real?"
The man cold, a stereotype that men suffer more than women when sick. However, there may be some truth in it. For SARS-CoV-2, the virus that caused the COVID-19 pandemic, and its deadlier cousins, MERS and SARS-1, males are more likely to get infected and become seriously ill compared to females. But what causes this sex bias? One factor that may influence whether you experience severe or more mild infection is differences in how the sex hormones communicate during infection, specifically testosterone in males and estrogen in females. But how the sex hormones contribute to SARS-1, 2, and MERS severity has yet to be explored, until now. My name is Marin Habbick, and to investigate the influence of sex hormones in coronavirus disease severity, I will answer 3 questions. Question 1, do sex hormones impact viral replication in human cells? To do this, we have a petri dish of cells. We add our sex hormones, we add our virus, and then we measure how much virus is entering the cells. Once inside, how successful it is at making copies of itself, and how many copies can pass quality control and can go and infect cells nearby. Now, if there is a change in viral replication, how are the sex hormones doing this? Leads to question 2. What are the chemical messages underlying sex hormone action in human cells? But first, what's a chemical message? Well, hormones are like your body's Canada Post. They take instructions from one place and tell your cells what to do in another place. So, we'll identify the instructions sent by testosterone and estrogen and see if there's any differences in the way they respond to infection, if they're helping or hurting the fight against it. So again, we bring back our petri dish. We add our sex hormones, we add our virus, but this time, rather than studying how the virus reacts, we see how the cells react. So now you may say, questions 1 and 2 only look at sex hormones in a petri dish. That's not very representative of a whole organism. And you'd be right. So, question 3. Do sex hormones impact disease severity in animals? We have data from a past project of male and female animals infected with MERS. By analyzing the infection response in these groups, we can determine if sex hormones serve as a puppet master during infection and influence how sick these animals get. But why should you care about sex hormones and coronavirus infection? Well, 3 pathogenic coronaviruses have emerged in 20 years. More will surely come, and we still don't fully understand why some people get really sick and others don't. My work will determine how sex hormones contribute to coronavirus disease severity and will thus lay the foundation for future therapies to tackle this sex bias. So buckle up, ladies, because this man-cold thing isn't going away anytime soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Marin. Now, obviously, you mentioned the coronavirus. Are there any other viruses that the man cold is affecting?
Yeah, so this is kind of a new area of research. We don't have concrete answers, but generally the evidence shows that males are more susceptible to be infected. But there are some cases where women are the party that has a worse experience, such as measles, HIV, but we're trying to figure out why.
So if men get more sick, women just kind of
So, for women, we do mount a stronger response. We're able to clear the virus faster, but sometimes your body mounts an overactive response, and this is what can lead to something called autoimmunity. So actually, like 80% of autoimmune diseases are found in women. So they're stronger in clearing the viruses, but they still have some negative effects. Okay.
And you're obviously in the lab working closely with all these things, and we've all spent years trying to get away from COVID. How are you staying safe with your research?
So learning to work with coronaviruses is kind of like learning to drive a car. First, you have to prove that you're worthy in the classroom. You got to study, do the biosafety training. And then you're supervised in the lab for many, many hours. And then finally, when they believe that you can drive on your own, that's when you're allowed to do the work alone. So it's a long process to get from A to B, but that's important considering what we do.
Excellent job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and with that, we will now take a 15-minute break. So it's about 2:55 right now, so if you can all come back around 3:10, that would be excellent. Thank you. All right, welcome back, everybody. Thank you again for rejoining us. Our next presenter is Olivia Kehler. Olivia is in the Master of Arts in Environmental and Social Change program at the University of Winnipeg. Her presentation is titled Researcher Reflexivity on Empowering Practice in Indigenous Community Engaged Research.
We're in a room full of researchers. Did you know that as a researcher, you have power? The person you are and your experience of the world shape the questions you ask and the way you design a research project. This is hard to avoid. We can try to be objective, but at the end of the day, we are driven by our own perspectives. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes it has made research unbalanced. For example, Indigenous peoples have been on the receiving end of a lot of research that benefits professionals without necessarily benefiting the communities involved. Now, have you heard of participatory research? This is research that works with real people to find solutions that work. Research with immediate impact. In this type of work, researchers pride themselves on flipping the script by putting power into the hands of community members. Instead of disempowering communities, which has sometimes been an unfortunate result of research projects, this is research that empowers. But before we get too excited about that, there's another thought that I want to throw into the mix. Do you know what else has power? Words. I started to look closely at what researchers mean when they say their project is empowering, and honestly, pretty vague. There's not a lot of definitions of what this means, and there's some real contradictions in what people say. Some say that empowerment means giving power to participants, as if there's only a little bit of power that has to be distributed carefully. Others say that power isn't something that can be given or taken away, that all of us have it no matter what, and all it does is grow. Some say that a project has to be extremely participatory in order to be empowering. Others say, well, you can't mandate participation. What's really empowering is letting communities be as involved as they want to be. Some say that empowerment means independence. Others say that it means collaboration. Do you know what most everyone does seem to agree on, though? That empowerment is essential and that we must do it now. Okay, great. But my question is, do what? What do we mean when we say we're empowering people through research with all these contradictions? So that's what my thesis project is looking at. I'm interviewing 15 experienced community-based researchers to try to figure out what we mean when we say we're empowering people through research. I don't have answers yet, but I do think I'm asking a lot of good questions. No matter what background you're coming from, I'm sure there are terms that come up in your field where once you start asking deeper questions, the actual meaning is not so clear. What do I actually mean when I use that word? I would encourage you to ask and to keep asking those questions. Because remember, you and your words have power. And you know what? If you don't pause and look around, you might one day find that you've been driving blind. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Could you tell us a bit about your master's program? What does an environmental and social change program focus on exactly?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about my program because I think it's really cool. I'm the Master of Environmental and Social Change program at UWinnipeg. It's an interdisciplinary program. You can do a Master of Arts, Science, or Environment all in the same master's program. So it's bringing together students from different backgrounds to talk about environment and related topics. So there's a lot of emphasis on collaboration for problem solving, which I have found super enriching.
Is there anything you can share with us about if there's any preliminary results from your interviews that you're able to talk about a bit?
My interviews have been super interesting. So when I wrote my 3MT, that was before I had done any, and now I've done all of them, which ended up being 17. It's hard to talk about them when my results aren't out yet, but I will say that power is a very layered topic. I found it super interesting to hear from researchers about their own experiences with all the different power dynamics that go on in a research project. There's the institution, there's the community, there's the researcher themselves. So I'm looking forward to trying to find names and categories, because what pushed me to do this project is power is something that's mentioned so frequently in the literature on community-based research, but I really struggled to find any sources really that gave a good description of what it means to give participants power when it seems to be so important. So yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing my results, but right now at this moment, I don't have a lot to give you, but stay tuned.
Is there anything you want to talk about of why empowerment was it seems so important to you?
My undergrad was international development studies, so I think similar to my topic, you can really see how your own story shapes the things you decide to talk about. In international development studies, there's this big emphasis on power and how the politics or whatever types of power you're talking about can shape who, international development studies is basically the study of like poverty and aid and how to address those things, and power is really central to that. So as I was coming into this research project, I noticed the word power come up so often. So my background made that stand out to me and want to hopefully do a project that would help people know how to address that in their own projects.
Very interesting. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
And up next, we have Crystal Sandoval. Crystal is in the Master of Arts in Environmental Education and Communication program at Royal Roads University. Her presentation is titled Mountain and Ocean Movements, Extending Sense of Self and Community with Nature.
Picture doing your favorite hobby. Whether it's crafts, games, or sports, our hobbies connect us with the things we care about and give us a sense of who we are. Now, pondering pollution isn't usually high on that list of activities, but what if a hobby made the environment personal? I combined my martial artist and environmental educator backgrounds to explore movement's effects on my sense of self and community. My thesis asks, if the body learns to move as mountains and oceans, does the practitioner gain a more embodied and interconnected perspective? For this study, I trained for 4 months in a Hawaiian martial art called Kai Ewalu Lua. My kumu, or teacher, used nature metaphors to both explain the movements and to frame life lessons. Therefore, I used 2 methodologies: autophenomenography to gather data on my experience of movement, and ethnography to gather data on the cultural context of Lua. Autophenomenography is a first-person study that captures lived experiences through writing. Credibility comes from consistent, candid reflections that include how my background may influence present perspectives. Journaling is most common, but adding a visual component was crucial for tracking potential connections between movement and thought. I wrote or audio journaled daily and video recorded my practices weekly. An ethnographic lens was also essential because of the Hawaiian culture deeply woven within the martial art, like indigenous vocabulary in stories. I gathered this data by immersing myself in class discussions, readings, events like outdoor practices and seminars, and I also conducted multiple interviews with my kumu, Michelle Manu, who graciously shared her expertise with me. For 5 months, I reviewed these rich experiences looking for patterns, and I found that as I moved, I connected more deeply with my body and the body of the land around me. My research started during the COVID-19 pandemic, and despite the limited contact with other people, the effects of my sense of self, community, and the environment still apply today. Mountains became metaphors for structure and stability. Oceans, metaphors for fluidity and change. Mountain movements helped me to gather my intentions. Ocean movements to release my grief. Fluctuations in movement reflected cycles and opportunities for change and resilience in my life and my environmental work. I plan to share these mental and physical lessons with my students to foster a better understanding of their environment, their self, and their extended relationships. I share the potential of embodied learning to inspire others to move as mountains and oceans in your way, to move in a connected human and non-human community towards a healthier future. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. Now, you just mentioned some of the metaphors that you've learned.
Yes.
Are there any others that you encounter during data collection?
Oh, so many. So Nalu is specifically tides, but I found another very interesting thing with Io, which is a hawk, which is elbow strike, or this movement in dances. But if I say hawk, that's going to be different for me versus hawk for somebody else. We all kind of have a different picture of what a hawk is.
And how was your experience with this Hawaiian martial art different from your other experiences?
Yeah, so different martial arts have different sort of intentions to them. Some are more geared towards self-defense, some are geared towards competition, some are geared towards building up culture and preserving that culture. And so the Hawaiian martial art, or at least in my teacher, because each teacher also brings a different sort of intention to their martial art. And in the Hawaiian martial art, my teacher brought a lot of the cultural, spiritual lessons into those physical movements.
Are there any challenges you want to talk about that you faced during this research?
Getting up all the time. So dedicating myself to do these practices and then realizing that everything is very messy. And so even on the days when I felt like I didn't want to get up, especially during COVID, and I'm like, none of this matters. Why am I doing this? Realizing that it was all part of this process of change and growing and resilience. And so that was a challenge, as well as learning how to work with technology and recording that technology. So, yeah.
Excellent job. Very interesting. Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you.
We'll just take a minute to let our judges finish their scoring and just hold on. All right, and we're back. Our next presenter is Nada Al-Amadi. Nada is in the Doctor of Philosophy in Microbiology and Immunology program at UBC Vancouver, and her presentation is titled Disarming C. difficile, the Fragmented Approach.
Raise your hand if you have ever taken antibiotics. Most of us have, because they are life-saving treatments. But did you know that they have a dark side? Antibiotics do not distinguish between bad bacteria and good bacteria. So they end up killing both, leaving an open door for invaders like C. difficile to thrive. In fact, taking antibiotics increases your chances of getting a C. difficile infection by up to 10 times. And this is a nasty bacteria that causes severe diarrhea, that is difficult to treat, and that could ultimately lead to death. And the problem that we have with C. difficile infections is that current treatments are just not good enough. We rely on using even stronger antibiotics that kill off even more of the patient's healthy bacteria. And what the catch is? A lot of C. difficile found ways to survive these treatments anyways. Luckily, there are new emerging treatments like the use of antibodies, which are proteins that help us fight disease. C. difficile causes diarrhea by producing a lot of toxins that directly damages the gut, and antibodies are capable of binding to these toxins and neutralizing their effect. But Like a knight in a shining armor, antibodies are so good at fighting battles, but they're not so good at squeezing in tight spaces in the gut where toxins usually hide. And this is where my research comes in. Instead of using a whole antibody, we have the technology that allows us to create much smaller fragments that are just as effective. And the best part is, they're even better than antibodies at reaching toxins in their hiding spots. To test these fragments in the lab, I used cells that usually die when they're exposed to C. difficile toxin. After I treated them with the fragments, I found out that they were able to survive a toxin attack, meaning that our treatment has worked. So the next step in my project would be to test these fragments in mice that are infected with C. difficile, an infection that unfortunately kills them. But I believe that our treatment is going to help them recover. The ultimate goal of my project is to create a future where antibiotics are used as a tool for healing instead of a gamble with potentially serious side effects. I believe that this project is going to help us move a step forward to making this future happen.
Excellent job, thank you. So what initially drew you to focus your research on C. difficile infections, and why is this area particularly important in the field of microbiology?
Yeah, so initially I was always interested in learning more about the gut, because I always had gut issues since I was a kid. And I found this research to be interesting because I was like, oh, okay, I'm interested in bacteria, so what should I look into? And I looked into C. difficile infections, and a lot of us end up taking antibiotics, like I just said earlier. But the problem is, like, we never think about what the consequences of taking antibiotics are. And it hit me really hard when I had to do a surgery, and then I was taking strong antibiotics to prevent me from having infections due to the surgery. But I realized that I could get a C. diff infection. I'm very susceptible to it right now. So I was eating a lot of yogurt and fermented food because I was panicking. And then I looked at real stories from people who had this infection. And I feel because we don't really think about it much, we don't think that, oh, this is going to happen to me. But seeing real people, people who are my age, healthy people get it, and they keep on getting recurrent infections. And it's very frustrating. So, yeah.
And can you discuss the potential implications of your research for the treatment of other bacterial infections beyond C. difficile?
Yeah, so these fragments are very versatile. So you can make them target anything that you want. So if you know how a bacteria works, if you know what toxin this bacteria makes, or if there's a particular way they work, you could make a fragment that could target this particular toxin or molecule that the bacteria produces.
And finally, how do engineered antibody fragments specifically target and neutralize C. difficile toxins without affecting the beneficial bacteria in the gut?
Yeah, so this is the best part about it. You might not have to take antibiotics to treat C. difficile. You can allow your healthy gut bacteria to repopulate naturally, and that would be sufficient to protect you from C. diff. Because in fact, people who who haven't taken antibiotics recently or don't have lowered immune system, they could have C. difficile in their gut, but without having any disease. And actually, a new treatment approach for C. difficile patients is to do fecal microbiota transplant, which is to get feces from someone who's healthy, filter it, and then give it to them. And this seems to be curing the issue. So the entire problem is that the population in the gut is dysregulated. So if we give them the chance to clap back, we can treat the disease.
Excellent job. Thank you, Nada. Our next presenter is Megan Franks. Megan is in the Doctor of Business Administration program at Athabasca University. Her presentation is titled, "It's About Engagement, Not Management, the Key to Volunteer Retention."
I never knew what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I still don't. But I knew that I was passionate about making communities better. So when I was 17 and fresh out of high school, I packed a bag and I flew from Alberta to the southern United States, where I spent most of my adult life recruiting volunteers for hundreds of nonprofits. and witnessing firsthand how volunteers are the driving force behind impactful community change. This became clear to me in 2005 as I watched as Hurricane Katrina ripped through the Gulf Coast. Entire communities were destroyed. Over 2,000 people were killed. Thriving neighborhoods now look like graveyards, just rows upon rows of concrete slabs. But over 800,000 people volunteered in the aftermath of that hurricane, contributing some 18 million hours of labor to rebuild devastated areas. So I generated an image of what New Orleans might look like today if nobody volunteered to help after Katrina, and an image of what New Orleans does look like today. This visual demonstrates the transformative power of volunteerism. Yet while some 80% of nonprofits rely on volunteers, global volunteerism is declining and retention rates continue to plummet. And why? The traditional management models that most nonprofits rely on fall short of engaging volunteers effectively. They view volunteers through a lens of control, while volunteers see their service through a lens of leisure. My work advocates for engagement models, fostering inclusive leadership and psychological safety, which provides more consideration for the diversity and uniqueness of all people. Because what I found when I surveyed over 500 active volunteers is that those that felt safe being their authentic self, included in reaching the organization's mission, and empowered were more likely to be engaged, and as a result, they were more involved, they were more likely to donate, and they were more likely to be retained. So as we continue to confront these complex world challenges like poverty and environmental crises, volunteerism remains a cornerstone of progress. By reimagining nonprofits as centers for volunteer engagement, we can cultivate a society where everyone is actively contributing to building a brighter future. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. What would you say motivated you to pursue the field of research?
So the first job I had after my master's degree was to build a volunteer center from nothing. So I spent about 10 years doing that, and what I found is that some nonprofits were really successful at engaging volunteers, while others were just not very good at it. And it wasn't the ones that you thought were good. The ones that had a dedicated volunteer manager, policies and procedures in place, were often relying on those policies and procedures for engagement. And they're not engagement models, they're management models. But then I found some of our nonprofits were really effective. They led with inclusion, they created safe environments where volunteers could be themselves. And as a result, volunteers continued to flock towards these organizations. So I wanted to study this phenomena in my own way.
And how do you envision your research contributing to your field?
Nonprofits don't have models for engagement. They have models for management, but not engagement. And so hopefully I can, shift the needle towards that, provide them some solutions and strategies for effectively engaging volunteers, and perhaps providing more solutions to community problems.
Were there any unexpected findings in your research?
So the one thing that I added in my research was about volunteer giving. So I worked for a large national nonprofit, and what I found is that we weren't targeting our volunteers when we were trying to find people to donate to a lot of our funds. And so in going through that research, volunteers were voiced that they were willing to donate, and they would gift, that they often weren't asked. And so that was one variable that I included that demonstrate that volunteers are donors, and they give time, but they give resources and money as well.
Great job. Thank you, Megan. And our next presenter is Dar Dar-Tripathy. Darsh is in the Master of Science in Kinesiology program at the University of Calgary, and his presentation is titled, Does Inherent Aerobic Capacity Protect Against Knee Joint Degeneration?
I'm confident that all of you have met someone at some point in your life who's lucky enough to eat whatever they want and not gain any weight. You've also probably met someone on the other end of the spectrum, like me, who simply gains 10 pounds by smelling a cookie. Well, if you hit the genetic lottery, have what is known as a high aerobic capacity or a high metabolism, you may be protected from excessive weight gain and metabolic disorders such as obesity. Obesity is a global health epidemic, and currently over 3 billion people are classified as obese. Obesity causes many health problems and is associated with an increased body mass. This increased body mass puts an immense amount of pressure on our knee joints, causing degeneration in our knee joints known as knee arthritis. Knee arthritis is a very serious condition that worsens with time and affects an individual's ability to walk and perform daily physical activities. Interestingly though, individuals with obesity also get arthritis in their hands and wrists, which are non-weight-bearing joints. This suggests that the relationship between obesity and arthritis cannot be purely due to the increased body mass. There must be something happening inside our body, metabolically, that is causing the joint to degenerate. This type of arthritis is known as metabolic arthritis. For my study, I wanted to see if I can prevent metabolic arthritis by utilizing the extraordinary power of the high aerobic capacity gene. To do this, we used rats specifically bred for aerobic capacity. Here we have rats with a low aerobic capacity, which are essentially these couch potatoes. And on the other hand, we have rats with a high aerobic capacity, which are these elite athletes. To induce obesity, we fed both of these rats a high-fat, high-sucrose diet for 12 weeks and then analyzed the knee joints. After 12 weeks of the high-fat, high-sucrose diet, the rats with a low aerobic capacity showed substantial degeneration in their joints, meaning that the joints were not protected in the presence of obesity. However, the rats with a high aerobic capacity appeared to be completely protected from degeneration, even in the presence of obesity. Now, how do we translate this to humans? Well, my findings suggest that a high aerobic capacity protects against metabolic arthritis. And fascinatingly, we can improve aerobic capacity via aerobic exercise. This means with enough cardio, people like me can smell as many cookies as they want and not have to worry about it. Yeah.
Thank you. What was the most interesting part of your research?
Honestly, probably working with these rats. Like when I say they're low, or like if I pulled out one of the low capacity rats, put the rat on the ground, he's not going to move for like the next 5 hours. Like he's just going to lay there. Whereas the high capacity runners, like as soon as like their toenails touch the ground, they're gone. So learning how to deal with that was very, very fun. And thankfully everyone back home in the lab, Marisa, everyone was great. So yeah, it was very fun. So yeah.
So was this your first time working with rats?
And yeah.
What was that?
It was my first time. It was, yeah, you know, I trained at the hospital with regular rats, and yeah, it did not help at all, by the way. So it was very fun learning with these rats.
And why did you choose this field to research?
So osteoarthritis, I tore my ACL, MCL, and PCL and meniscus all at once playing basketball. And after my surgery, the surgeon was like, you might get OA. And I'm like, dude, don't lie. You know I'm going to get OA. So I was like, might as well do some research in that field. And that was kind of the motivation. So yeah.
Excellent job.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just let our judges take a minute to finish their scoring. Okay, our next presenter is Anam Ara. Anam is in the Master of Science in Biochemistry and Medical Genetics program at the University of Manitoba, and her presentation is titled, Is All Smoke the Same?
Cannabis and the word high are often being used together. Well, here, it's not that high you're thinking about. It's high time for us to focus on research that help us to understand safety of cannabis use. What's scary is surveys have reported up to 30% of pregnant women consume cannabis. So who is at risk? It's both the mother and the child. In fact, research have shown children whose mothers were exposed to smoke particle from sources like cigarette smoke or air pollution are at higher risk of developing lung diseases like asthma. But my question is all smoke the same? Well, for cannabis, we do not know that yet. In order to understand how smoke exposure affects health, there is a promising approach called epigenetics. Epigenetic acts as a link between your environment and health. Epigenetic is a process that regulates the gene expression without making any structural change to it. Hold on, let me make it more clear to you. For example, let's assume these bulbs to be your genes and these switches as epigenetic process. Depending on the smoke in the environment, these switches control the functioning of these bulbs. Therefore, these bulbs may glow brighter, dim, or can even go off. What I mean by brighter, dim, and off is epigenetic process can make your genes to express more, less, and even shut them off. And this is well known, interfering with the normal gene function causes abnormality. The question that I'm trying to answer through my project is how early life cannabis smoke exposure affects your child's lungs. My research aims to investigate potential epigenetic changes caused by cannabis consuming pregnant women that leads to asthma in their children. This will be achieved using mice as a model organism. Utilizing the robotics technology, mice are exposed to cannabis smoke and their genes are evaluated for epigenetic changes causing asthma. Well, not to forget about my initial question about similarity among smoke. To answer this, I'll also compare the effect of cannabis smoke with the cigarette smoke. This comparison will give us a bigger picture about new gene and mechanism associated with asthma. In conclusion, this study is of critical importance, as it not only highlights the role of cannabis in asthma, but also helps us to understand safety of cannabis use, so that in future, every child has an equal opportunity to breathe better. Thank you.
Excellent job. Now, you mentioned the use of robotics. Can
Yeah.
you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Before coming here, we were talking while having lunch about the mice getting high. Yeah, so this robots help us to get mice high. Yeah. So this is a compact inhalation system that gives a whole body exposure to the rodents. The best thing about this machine is it has helped us to control the smoke concentration that is getting into the chamber to the mice, thus reducing the variability in the research that we are doing.
So you'll also be using mice in your research?
Exactly, yeah.
Is this going to be your first time?
No,
Oh,
I've been
that's-
doing, yeah.
So you have experience in that
Yeah,
field.
yeah.
Excellent. And what sparked your interest in all this?
Okay, so when my PI gave me the topics to choose, so there were a lot of topics that I have been given to choose. So when I heard the word cannabis, I was very eager to research on that because it has been legalized in Canada, and I really want to see that what kind of a disease burden that actually we are legalizing a disease burden by legalizing cannabis in Canada. So I really want to know that is there something that is associated with asthma that is coming up.
And how does your research impact everyday life or address real-world problems?
Okay, yeah. So since legalization, there has been an increase in cannabis user, and running parallel to this, there are increase in asthma patient as well. So this research will give a platform or an evidence for the cannabis safety guidelines that can be built up, or cannabis safety regulations that can be come up. Yeah.
Excellent job. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
Next up, we have Navid Ali. Navid is in the Master of Education in Educational Leadership Program at Vancouver Island University. His presentation is titled Super Diversity as a Superpower, Honoring IBPOC Stories in Provincial Literacy Assessment Practices.
When I was 2 years old, my mother packed all of our belongings from our apartment nestled upon the frozen shores of Lake Ontario and crammed everything into a singular, cavernous, pinstriped blue suitcase. To this day, I have no idea how she lifted such a monstrous thing by herself, other than the sheer force of will that it takes for a mother to want a better life for her son upon her homeland, the island nation of Singapore. My experiences as a learner in Singapore were at the very best challenging. My mind regurgitates memories of chalk-infused air lazily circulating around the Chinese language classroom, and my mind floating like a balloon engorged with my apparent incompetencies in grasping the Chinese language curriculum. On the first day of class, my Chinese language teacher smiled, looked at me, and said, "You will be called Lami." These are the characters that you see on the upper left and middle of the slide in front of you, and together they mean pull rice. There's no whimsical nor metaphorical meaning behind this name, but as a fairly rotund child, my peers created their own. I never saw myself in this name, in the same way that I never saw myself within the high-stakes standardized assessments that were rampant within the Singaporean educational system and Chinese language curriculum. And I know now, through my learning about learning, that my ineptitude had an engine fueled by the lack of acknowledgement of my super diverse self within these high-stakes standardized assessments. I went through the dehumanizing act of being reduced to a test score in Singapore, and I see these experiences mirrored in my role as an educator as I prepared learners to sit for the Ontario Secondary School Literacy Test in Toronto. I presently have the honor of learning alongside youth upon the traditional territories of the Haida Nation, whereby we share stories in learning, only to watch these stories dissolve the moment we begin conversations about the provincial graduation literacy assessment. I have learned that many Indigenous, Black, and people of color learners do not feel seen nor heard within these high-stakes assessments, and I see their story within my own. It is these experiences, alongside the work of academics such as Sarah Davidson and Nikki Yee, that have brought me to my inquiry. In what ways are the super diverse and intersectional stories of IPOC learners' experiences honored in decolonized and anti-racist mediums within high-stakes standardized assessments such as the GLA and the OSSLT? Now, last summer, a cousin who lives in Taiwan smiled, looked at me, and said, "You should change your name to La Mi." The simple change of intonation sent a wave of warmth throughout my body as he mentioned to me what those words meant. Spicy, pungent, powerful. These are the characters that you see on the bottom left and middle of the slide in front of you, and these are the characters that I now use to describe my super diverse self. It took me 25 years for me to see myself in my learning of the Chinese language, yet I know that many Indigenous, Black, and people of color learners in the system today still feel invisible in their learning. And my hope is that by sharing stories and bridging experiences, we can change the way that we experience education. Thank you. Hawa. Xie Nandri.
Excellent job.
Thank you.
What is the alternative to high-stakes standardized assessments that would honor the super diversity of learners?
I believe strongly that compassion and connection are ways that we can do so. However, before I continue, to highlight the importance of compassion in the educational system of our global community, I would like to read this poem by Mahmoud Darwish, Palestinian poet and author, to honor the lives lost and currently under siege in Palestine, as well as to honor the lives of those lost and affected by violence against Indigenous women, girls, two-spirit, and gender-diverse people. Violence eliminates love. Genocide does not feel. Colonization has no empathy. Education is one of the ways to fight genocide, to fight colonization through empathy, connection, compassion, listening, and learning. Those who are in education, it is up to you to honor this. Do not forget, your silence is complicit in this darkness. This is the poem Think of Others by Mahmoud Darwish. As you prepare your breakfast, think of others. Do not forget the pigeon's food. As you conduct your wars, think of others. Do not forget those who seek peace. As you pay your water bill, think of others, those who are nursed by clouds. As you return home to your home, think of others. Do not forget the people of the camps. As you sleep and count the stars, think of others, those who have nowhere to sleep. As you liberate yourself in metaphor, think of others, those who have lost the right to speak As you think of others far away, think of yourself. Say, if only I were a candle in the dark. To acknowledge the question, the alternative to high-stakes standardized assessments are rooted in an overall encompassing sense of trust and empathy. Curriculum-based assessments built upon decolonized and anti-racist practices and pedagogies open decolonizing opportunities within assessment practices that are found on the high expectation relationships built over the course of time and trust forged between learner and educator. These trust-fueled relationships are fundamental in establishing safety in learning that open decolonized and anti-racist possibilities for learners to express themselves in ways that honor their diversity. This model of assessment will eliminate the stigmatization, bias, and lack of acknowledgement of superdiversity within the one-size-fits-all model applied to standardized assessments. And furthermore, educators are already doing this and empowering their learners by honoring their superdiversity in classrooms all across the country and the world. Curriculum-based assessments would honor the relationships between educators and ministries of education by instilling trust in the classroom practices of educators rather than upheaving the forged learning relationships between learners and educators in favor of the formalized and dehumanizing process of high-stakes standardized assessments. Feeling trusted in the learning process is one of the greatest identifiable trail markers in the goal to achieve empowerment in deepened learning. And when this transcends to both educator and learner, the possibilities of learning are endless.
And can you talk about the people who have guided your inquiry?
Thank you. I would like to thank the Syilx Okanagan Nation for the opportunity to be here and learning upon their wondrous traditional and ancestral land. I would like to express my deepest gratuity to the elders, community members, learners, and staff upon the traditional territories of the Haida Nation, whereby I am privileged and thankful to be a settler educator upon that magnificent land. I'd like to thank my family and friends who have done everything from placing posters on university poster boards to supporting me with kind words when the going got tough. To my aunties, my uncles, my grandmothers, grandfathers, mothers, fathers, and ancestors, this would be nothing without you. To the incredible learners and staff that I've shared experiences in learning with. I would like to thank Dr. Paige Fisher, my thesis supervisor, and all the professors and instructors who have guided me on this path, as well as Sarah Davidson and Nikki Yee for highlighting the importance of superdiversity in education through their words in research in supporting me on this journey. Allison, you have been my rock throughout this process, and words cannot express how much you mean to me. Thank you.
Excellent job. Thank you so much. And our final presenter this afternoon is Erin Williams. Erin is in the Doctor of Philosophy in Biomedical Physiology and Kinesiology program at Simon Fraser University. Her presentation is titled Rhythm Beneath the Waves, the Challenges of Fainting During Artistic Swimming.
Imagine running the 400-meter dash, but you're holding your breath underwater. Can't touch the bottom, tightly surrounded by 7 others doing the same. Now smile, make it look effortless. This is artistic or synchronized swimming. In the slide, you'll see me as a high-performance athlete, and I'm now a professional coach. The sport is my passion. But as a researcher, it caught my eye because it poses the heart with a very unique set of stressors. Some athletes have even fainted during the routine, which is a drowning risk, but we're not quite sure why this happens. Through both my lenses, I want to know how artistic swimming affects the heart. First, we reviewed what could be happening based on how we know the heart reacts to some key stressors. And we found that there is a lot going on. Responses to water, responses to breath holding, straining while you're breath holding, hyperventilating when you do breathe, responses to exercise, cold, add in performance anxiety. I'm out of breath listing these. The point is, some gear up the heart into fight or flight, while others slow it down and pump the brakes. These are normal, but what's unique is when conflicting signals are sent together, gas and brakes at the same time. This creates a state called heart conflict that can cause irregular heartbeats. This can cause fainting, and it's thought to play a role in some drownings. We're now studying this in action by looking at heart electrical activity while athletes train. And so far, even the simplest breath holding drills have caused irregular heartbeats, like the one I've shown. Not just one blip, but a pattern of many in a row like we know heart conflict can cause. So from here, how common is it? Is it actually risky? And how do athletes' hearts adapt over time? But another important piece is real-world impact. Breath holding is uncomfortable. It carries some risks. Yet it's embedded into our sport. How do athletes and their coaches manage this? We're working with a team of community members to better understand their lived experiences and perspectives, and shockingly, most had witnessed at least a handful of fainting events in young, apparently healthy, high-performance athletes. Imagine the stress of blacking out when facing the underwater 400-meter dash is already grueling. The last thing that any athlete wants to be thinking about before diving in to compete on the world stage is, will she? Will I make it up from this swim? With this work, we hope to provide management recommendations to affected athletes, their teammates, and their coaches to improve aquatic sport safety. But this work could also help improve drowning safety off the pool deck, say at the beach, while you're boating, or after some sort of an accident. Here, I'm looking beyond surface performance, and it seems like the answers might just lie in the heart's rhythm beneath the waves. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. Can you elaborate a bit more on heart conflict and what other areas this could come up?
Yeah, absolutely. So heart conflict, again, it comes down to the high sympathetic or fight or flight, as well as the high parasympathetic, your pump the brakes or rest and digest, it's sometimes called. So when these two things happen together, it confuses the heart the same way that your engine would be confused if you were to hit gas and brakes at the same time. It wouldn't go so well. So all that to say, this is what's causing irregular heartbeats like this one. And we see that in other places like spinal cord injury because the neurons that are, or pardon me, the nerves that are controlling these responses are damaged. And then it's also quite common in the sport of open water swimming because we have the really high pre-activation from the event, the exercise response at the same time that somebody's going into the cold water, and as water hits the face, that causes something called a diving response, which turns down the heart rate because your body knows that it's to conserve energy in the water. This is in many mammals and it's also in humans. So all that to say, we're looking at artistic swimming because it's a very unique place where people might be experiencing heart conflict all the time. So this allows us to learn more about this mechanism that can be problematic, but I mean, in the sport of artistic swimming, perhaps it's less problematic. And on that spectrum, we do see individuals that are fainting. So it's that really unique setting for us to study something that's happening in many other places.
And during your time as an artistic swimmer and now coach, have you ever witnessed yourself somebody faint?
So I have. I've never fainted myself. It's happened in a few places that I've seen or heard of, but my earliest memory was when another athlete at our club, I was about 11 or 12 at the time, but another athlete on a higher level team was swimming what's called a double under. So you swim 2 lengths underwater without coming up to breathe. And that sounds very intense, but it is very typical in our sport because you could imagine, like any other physical ability, you have to train the breath holding as well, with some sort of an overload in order to get better over time. So all that to say, there are a lot of practical problems that come with this trait being embedded into the sport, which is why we reached out to community members. I mean, in part because artistic swimming is a very small community, but there are so many practical layers to this issue, and we've learned a ton from them about the issue overall.
And you mentioned that some of your work is with community partnerships. So what does that look like and how is that being done?
Yeah, so kind of building off the last question there, community partnered or community informed research is exactly as the name describes. Doing research that is informed by the communities that the research is about. And the big saying in this space is nothing about us without us. So That's just emphasizing the value of making sure that your research questions are relevant to the communities that they're serving, which can ultimately help close the gap between research findings as well as that research kind of making a difference in daily life. So again, we've learned so much from our community members. We're very grateful for the partnerships that we've built with BC Artistic Swimming. And even myself, I've been a member of this community for 20 years, and I have learned a ton from other people because, I mean, my experience in the sport is only limited to my experience in the sport. So it's been very helpful.
Excellent job. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you.
Now that concludes the presentation portion of today's event. A huge congratulations to all of our presenters for putting on such a fantastic show. We can give them all a round of applause. It's now time for our judges to do the very impossible job of picking our winner for today. And while the judges do that, we're going to cast our vote for the People's Choice Award. This is where you can vote for the presentation you felt best met the criteria outlined in your program. To cast your vote, you can go to slido.com and enter the code 2024 Western Regional or scan the QR code on the screen. Voting is open to those in person and online. And while our judges deliberate and you vote, we are going to take a short break. Hello, everyone. If you can all take your seats, we're ready to begin. The judges' scores have now been counted and your ballots are in. We have winners to announce. And to begin that, I'd like to invite Dr. Peter Simpson on stage to announce the People's Choice Award winner.
Thank you, Victoria. Drum roll, please. The winner of the People's Choice Award is... Hey, you guys are good. Erin Williams.
Congratulations, Erin. And I'd now like to invite Martin Youssef on stage to announce our third place winner.
Great work, everyone. Drum roll as well, please. Thank you. Third place award goes to Alexandra Gagnon.
Congratulations, Alexandra. And for our second place winner, please welcome Heather Behringer to announce that one.
Thanks so much, everybody, for participating. I am so excited to announce second place and to fangirl for Michael Mensah.
Congratulations, Michael. And finally, the moment you've all been waiting for, the first place winner. And I'd like to invite Dr. Leslie Cormack on stage.
So our good friends from PricewaterhouseCoopers have handed, no, they have not. I am delighted to announce the first place winner, and it was a very difficult decision, I have to say, that this was an incredibly talented group. So can I just stretch this out any longer? The winner is Nada Al-Amadi.
Congratulations, Nada. And a big congratulations to all of our participants. Thank you all so much for coming out and putting on such an incredible show. Let's give them a round of applause. Now we're very close to the end of the afternoon, but before that, I'd like to invite Dr. Peter Simpson back on stage to provide some closing remarks.
Thanks, Victoria. I'll show you something you don't see very often, which is a professor speaking for 3 minutes. Congratulations to all of our participants, and a special thanks to all of you who traveled to be here today. And you know, it's a beautiful day in the Okanagan. We're happy to provide that at no extra cost. Special thanks to our judges, and I appreciate you took on a really difficult task. And I was hoping no fistfights would break out, and they didn't, which is great. I'd also like to thank Victoria Femia for being an excellent MC in Global Okanagan, and all our participants and family and friends for being here. Special thanks to College of Graduate Studies and other Okanagan staff and student volunteers for doing all the work that's needed to make this event happen. And biggest thanks of all to Alicia Meehan, who took on the mammoth task of organizing the whole thing. Thank you, Alicia. And now, for those of us here in person, let's enjoy the reception. There's food at the back.